Are you ready to integrate a web API with your Thunkable X app? Well, that's what we're doing in this video. Hey there friend, if you're new here, my name is Darren and I just want to welcome you to the channel, and I hope that you're going to enjoy this series where we're talking all about the web API. And we're going to jump straight into it because we have a lot to cover in this video today. So the app that we're making is called Brewbase. So essentially it's like a play on words of a database and brewery. And so what this app is going to be is like a database where a user can come and search a location and find a brewery, a microbrewery near them. So today we're going to jump straight into it. We're going to start out by picking a state. So we're going to have a screen where we can pick a state, then a screen where we show the results of the API based on the state they selected. And then once they select a brewery, then we're going to show information from that brewery on the screen. So let's jump into it. All right, so let's start off by creating a new app. We'll call this Brewbase API. And then this first screen, we're going to call it search. So this is where the users are going to search for a state. Now in this screen, we're going to add 3 elements. So we're going to add 2 labels. And then after that, we are going to add a list viewer. And we'll give this list a special name. So list, let's call it list of states. For the label, we will label this Brewbase. This will be the title of the app. We'll give it a font size of 30 and color it orange. For the label, we'll just say select a state to search by. And then for the list of states, let's go ahead and set a height of 70%. And then finally for the screen, so at the screen level, let's go ahead and set the vertical alignment to space between. And actually, let's change the list to be 80%. Yeah, there we go. That looks good. All right, so that's the design of it. Let's go ahead and block out the rest. So for this screen, we're going to add 3 variables. And in those 3 variables, we're going to have one that's going to store the, we'll call it state selected, the city selected, and a list, so a state list. So in our list viewer that we just added, we want to show a list of states. So this state list will be the list that stores that list of states. So let's go ahead and set all of these equal to something. We'll set the state list equal to the empty list. Mute this. All right, empty list, and then state and city selected, we're going to set those to null. And the reason we're doing this is we want these to start out as null and empty list, and then we'll define these when the page starts. So we'll go to search. So this is the actual search screen. So when search screen starts, we're going to set state and city selected to null again. So the state is going to be what we actually select from the list. And then the city selected, we're actually going to get into in the next video, but we need to add it on this screen because we want it to reset to null every time the user lands on this screen. Now to define the state list, we're going to do this on screen start as well. So let's go ahead and grab that set statement. And if you look down in the description, I actually have the list of states that we're going to be using. So just copy and paste that into this field here, and I'll do that now as well. All right, so you can see now I've added a list of states, and all of these are separated by a comma. Now putting this into a variable does not make it a list. We need to tell Thunkable to actually interpret this string or this text field as a list. So we can actually do that by grabbing another block in the list bucket. And it's all the way down at the bottom. It's this make list text from block. And I'll put that into the variable. And make list from text. Here's our text. With delimiter. So we'll throw another text field in here. Now a delimiter is basically what divides up each of the values. So how do we want to divide up Alabama from Alaska? Well, in between here, there is a comma and a space. So our delimiter is going to be a comma and a space. Now the space is important. So comma, space. And now that we have defined our state list, let's go ahead and show this state list in the list of states field inside of the design screen. So from list of states, set text items to, and we'll set it to the state list. All right, so now whenever the screen starts, we should see a list of states. Now one more thing before we go and test this out, let's go ahead and kind of define what's going to happen when we select a list. So when list of states, item clicks, when an item is clicked, what do we want to do? Well, there's a list of states, we select a state, so we want to record our selected state. So that's the first thing. We want to set state selected to the item selected. So now we have stored the state that was selected, and then we want to go to another screen. So let's go ahead and add the screen that we're going to go to, and that would be called, let's see, we're going to call this results. So we have a search screen and then a results screen. And then we're going to navigate to the results screen whenever an item is clicked. All right, let's go ahead and test this out. All right, so I've got my Thunkable Live test app up here, and I can see when I open up the app, I see a list of states. All of these look like normal US states. And when I select this, I would expect to go to another screen. And there we go, I go to a blank screen. So far, we are doing good. Let's jump into defining the results screen. On the results screen, there are a few things that we'll need. We're going to go ahead and add a label at the top. So this will be our title. We're going to add another label to show instructions. We're going to add a list viewer so we can show the results, all the breweries that were returned in the API call in a list. And then finally at the bottom, I'm going to add, let's do a row. And then inside of that row, we're going to add a button. So this is just going to give us a little bit of navigation. So this will actually be a search button. So let's go ahead and design this out. So the top label, we're going to call this brew base, just like we did on the last screen. Font size 30, and we'll give that an orange color. Now for the label, let's say this is the instructions, so we'll just say select a brewery to view more details. And we'll leave the rest of that the same. For this list viewer, let's go ahead and set the height to a percentage of 70%. And then for this row, we'll set this height to 15%. So height, percentage, 15. Alrighty, and then let's go ahead and define or kind of change the format of this button. We'll call this button New Search. We'll set the text color to orange. Did it do it? There we go. So yeah, now we have a new search button that is set to orange. Let's increase the size of that a little bit. Boom. All right, let's give this button a cool name. We'll say New Search Button. And for the list viewer, let's also give that a name. List of results. And then last thing to do is we want to set the screen's vertical alignment to space between, just to spread out all of these components. I think this is looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and get into the blocks of this screen. So there are a few variables. We're going to start off with defining some variables, and let's go ahead and do 4 of these. Now the first one is going to be a text field that's going to store the API URL. So we're going to be using a URL. So this right here is an example of a URL. It's how we get information on the web. It's how we go to websites. That's called a URL. So that's how we're going to retrieve the API response. And then once we get that response, we're going to have a variable to store that response. And this is going to be an empty list. So the API call is going to return a list of values. That's going to be our response. The next variable, let's call this names list. So once we get that response, we're going to create a list of names. And we're going to store this in another list. So we have 2 lists there. And lastly, similar to our state selected, we're going to have a brew selected. So whenever I select a brewery from the names list, we're going to store that in this variable called brew selected. And we can set that equal to null to start out. All right, now that we have the variables all defined, let's go ahead and define some of our functions, or rather some of our events. So the first event that we should handle is whenever the screen starts. So whenever our screen starts, we want to do a few things. We are going to first do some validation and make sure that our list of names is set to empty list. So whenever we come back to the screen, maybe we've already done a search or 2, we always want to reset the names list whenever this screen starts. So we will reset this to empty list. The next thing we want to do is we always want to reset this app URL. So we're going to do similarly what I just did for that. We're going to reset it, but instead of setting it to an empty text block, we're actually going to define the URL here. And I also have this URL defined in the description. So go ahead down there, it's called base API URL, and copy and paste that into this field. And so let me actually show you, just as a little teaser, what this actually looks like when you plug it in. So boom, so this URL is returning all of this data. This is actually a JSON list, or a list of JSON objects. And so this is what Thunkable was interpreting when we used the web API component. So I thought it'd be cool to show you what that actually looks like before we move any further. So we have names list set to empty. This should be API URL set to this text. Now that we have kind of the foundation set for us, let's actually get into the actual blocks that will call the API and give us some results. Now, before I do this, we actually need to add the web API component to the app. So I'll come over to the components, and we'll scroll down to the data section. And then in here, we're going to pull in the web API component. And so now that adds the web API to our app. And so let's just call this Brewbase API, and we'll leave everything else the same, as we're going to be setting it on the other screen, or in the block screen. So let's head back to the block screen. And now you see here the Brewbase API. And so whenever the screen starts, we want to go ahead and set the URL. So Brewbase API set URL. And we're going to set this to this variable plus the state that was selected. So let's come to text. We'll grab the join block. We're going to have three items here. So the first one is the API URL that we just defined here. Let's go ahead and drop that in. The last one is the state selected. And in between, what we need is some special characters that will tell the API what value we're giving it, so what value we're searching by. And so this one is specifically ampersand, or the and symbol, by underscore state equals. So effectively what we're doing is appending to the end of this URL and by state equal to state selected. So if I selected the state New York, I want to tell the API to only give me results that are in the state New York. So that's what this block right here does. And then the last thing that we need to do whenever the screen starts, after we have set the URL, is actually to get some things from the URL, get some things from the API. So back in the Brewbase API bucket, let's go ahead and get the block here in Brewbase API get. Alrighty, so I was going through and explaining all this, and it was getting kind of complicated. So I figured I would go ahead and complete this block here and then kind of walk through it. So there's 3 steps here: set response to the object from JSON of the response. So what this does is it turns the response, this jumble mess of data, into something that Thunkable can read. So that's what this block does: set response to response. Now from that response that we've now interpreted, we're going to loop through each of the items in the list and grab the name. So get name of object J. So each item in the list is an object J. We're going to grab the name and then insert that into our names list so that we have a list of names. And so now we have called the API. We've created a list of names from that API. And now we're going to actually show that list on the screen. So that's what this one does. From the list of results, set text items to. So we're setting the list to our names list. In the meantime, or at the same time, we're sorting these items alphabetically. So pretty simple. Once you kind of break down the parts, go ahead and pause the video if you're following along, or feel free to download the cheat sheet that covers this as well. That's available in the link in the description. Are you excited to see how this works? Let's go ahead and take a look. I'll open up the app, a fresh new app that I've reloaded. Let's go ahead and scroll through here and select a state like Nevada. And then we see we're on a new screen now. We have the title, we have the instructions, and now we have a different list. This is a list of names from the API. Now, the first time I got this to work, I thought it was so cool. And what's also cool is that you can do this with a lot of different APIs. I'll share a link down in the description. I think I'll call it like list of APIs. It's a GitHub repository that shows all of these public APIs that you could use to make a number of different apps. So that's a pretty cool thing that you should check out. But anyways, now, we have a list of brewery names. And so the last thing we need to do is do something when we select one of these, and do something when we select that new search button down at the bottom. So let's go ahead and tackle the search first, because this one's easy. So when new search button is clicked, we're going to go back to the search screen. So we'll navigate to search. So if they want to start a new search, we're just going to send them back to that screen. And the other item is when a list item is selected. So we'll go to list of results. That's our list. So when an item is clicked, well, we're going to do pretty much the same thing we did on the search screen. We're going to store what is selected in the brew selected variable. So we'll set brew selected to the item. And then we're going to navigate to a new screen. So the same thing, same procedure, it's just a different level of searching. So this new screen, I'm calling it info because we're going to be sharing the information about the brewery that is selected. So yeah, when an item is clicked, we'll store it in brew selected, and then we will navigate to the information screen. Let's actually just jump straight into the design of the info screen. So let's come over here to the app. We have a blank screen. Here is everything we're going to add. So let's add a label to start off. This will again be the title. Below that label, we're going to add another label. And below that label, so we have two labels, a button, and then below the third label, let's go ahead and add a row component. This will be similar to what we did on the last screen. A row, and then within that row, let's add a button. This is going to help us with our spacing. Let's go ahead and design each of these. So the top one, brew base. Font size of 30, and we will set the color to orange. Now for this next label, let's go ahead and, well, we can leave the text as label for now. Let's go ahead and call it something. We'll call it info brew name. This will be where we show the name. For the button, let's call this website button. This is going to allow us to go to their website. It's also stored in the API. And then in this last label, let's call this location, and we'll say label location so that we can show the location. And then let's go ahead and change this button to just say back and set the text to orange. And I'm doing this all kinds of out of orders. All of these below brew base, let's set these to 20. Font size to 20, that is. Placeholder of website. You know, this is a lot cleaner in my cheat sheet, I promise. I promise. I just can't talk and do this at the same time. All right, 20, and then the back button 20. All right, two more things, I think. So we'll set this row height to 15%. And then we'll set the screen, so the whole screen, let's set the vertical alignment to space between, just to space everything out. Okay, I think we got it. I think so. All right, let's go to the blocks screen. Alrighty, so we just need one variable here. We'll call this brew JSON. And let's go ahead and set this equal to null to start out. And so this is going to store, remember on the last screen we selected a brewery. So on this screen we're going to call that final brewery object, and then we're going to store that here in that JSON object. And JSON is just a way of storing and interpreting a set of data. All right, so let's go ahead and handle our events. So when the info screen starts, this will be the first one we tackle. We want to do similar to what we did on the results screen. Let me expand this. So you see here we set the URL and then we got the information. So we're going to do the same thing on the info screen. So from the API, let's go ahead and update the URL. And so we're going to do pretty much the exact same thing we did on the last one. Except this time, instead of adding the state, we're going to be adding the name that was selected. So we're going to start out with the API URL, and then we're going to append a string or a set of text here and add by name to that URL. And then lastly, let's go ahead and drop in the brew selected. Awesome. All right, so now that we have the new URL set, let's go ahead and get that information from the API. So the first line should look familiar. Same thing that we did in the last one. So brew JSON, get object from JSON, response. All right, this next one, there is a chance that multiple records are returned. So we're going to go ahead and kind of accommodate that by just grabbing the first one. So in the list that's returned, so let's go ahead and grab the in list get ID block here. So in list of brew JSON. So in this list that's returned, let's go ahead and make sure that we get the first item. So we're only working with one object. And then the last thing that we're going to do is I want to actually create a function for this, just to kind of separate out my code a little bit. And let's call this function populate info. And we will call this right after our last block there. So populate info. So in here, we're going to update all of those components on the design screen that we added. So let's go ahead and grab a set text to block for each of these. Now we'll duplicate this 3 times, actually 2 times. So we have the name, we have the website, and we have the location. So now all we need to use is the get property from object, because this right here returns an object. So the first one is name. The next one, let's actually take a look. I'll show you how I know what these fields are called. So this is the object that we're actually reading, or an example of it. You can see here we have a name field, we have a website URL, and then we'll also use the city and state after that. So here's how I know kind of what I'm looking for. So name, website URL, I'll just paste that in there. And then for the location, we're going to use a join statement to show the city and the state. So comma space, and then wrapping around that, we'll add the city. And the state. And for each of these, the object for each of these is the brew JSON. So we'll just drop this in to each of these. Now, one thing I learned when working through this process is actually like hitting the URL that we're using, like just throwing that up in my browser to narrow down my search. So each of those were a really long list, but as you begin refining your results, eventually you can start returning like one result. So here's an example here. If you're looking for this ID, you could just hit this URL, and that would return just one object. So this is how I kind of narrowed down the search and kind of did some debugging to kind of get what I needed. All right, so I think that should be everything we need. Let me check my notes. Yeah, I think we're good. Let's go ahead and see how this looks within the app. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and check this out. So I'm in the app. I can select a state. We've done this today. From that state, I can select a brewery. And then now we're on the info page, what we just did. And so now we see the name of the brewery I selected, their website, and their location. And you can feel free to add any other information you want on here. I just chose to do this. So the last 2 things that we want to do here is make the website do something. So actually go to the website, and then also kind of define the back button. So when back is selected, we'll go back to the search results. So both of these are really easy. You've done most of these before. For the button, I don't think actually, did I name this button? Let me make sure I named it. Yeah, we'll call this info back button, so I know what I'm working with on the blocks tab. So over here, come to the info back button bucket. When that is clicked, we will navigate to the results screen. Okay, check off. The last thing to do was to open up the website whenever we click that button. So website button, we want to grab the get text. So in our populate, let me expand this real quick. So here we've set website button text to the URL. So I can just recall what is in that text field to go to that website. So that's what I'm doing here. From website button get text. And then in control, down towards the bottom, there is a block called open link. So open link from website button get text. When do we want to do this? Well, we want to do this when they click on the website button. Pretty simple. So yeah, let's make sure both of these work, and we should be good to go for this API video. All right, the moment of truth, my friend. Let's do this. So let's select a good old state. Then we can select a brewery. So now we have the info which we just saw. Let's make sure the back button works. Cool, it brings me back. And then let's select another brewery. All right, cool. And so now when I click the website, it should open up the browser of my choice. And it looks like this website might not exist anymore. Let me give you another example. We'll do this one again. So Great Raft. Looks like it's already loaded. Cool, or loading again? I don't know. Maybe this was an example from before. But anyways, I know this was a long video. It might have been fast. If it was too fast for you, download that cheat sheet. But I wanted to put all of this in one video for you so you had one package, seeing how you can kind of populate that API URL, how you were able to show that information on the screen. And yeah, that's enough for today's video. All the links, URLs that I mentioned, will be in the description, so be sure to check that out. Be sure to check out all the videos in this series. I got more coming at you. Happy coding.